guys, let's have a talk about the lives of ancient women. Also, let me introduce my TA. This is Jimmy. Say hi to the students.
Student.
Oh, good job. They say hi to you too.
Okay.
All right. Would you like to help me talk to my students about women in the ancient world?
What?
Mm,
Banana bird.
yep. He might go play with his trucks in a minute. Okay, I'm going to start this off with a scene from the tragedy The Buckeye. So this is a tragedy based on an older myth wherein a guy named Pentheus denies the divinity of Dionysus. Because he's from Dionysus' hometown, he knows his mom. It's complicated. So in retaliation, Dionysus reaches out and touches his mom, putting her into a state of religious ecstasy. The followers of Dionysus, as I mentioned earlier, they'd get really drunk and then go out and roam the countryside. And according to legend, we're not sure if this was a thing that ancient people actually did, or if it's just an urban legend about previous generations of Dionysus worshippers. At any rate, Pentheus's mom goes into the countryside reveling with the Maenads, the party committee of Dionysus. And when her son goes to see what she's up to, she, in her altered state of mind, thinks he's a goat and rips him to pieces with all of her friends, and then comes back into town with her son's head like, "Hey, hail Dionysus, look at this goat." And they're like, "Oh, that's not a goat." And then she sobers up and she's like, "Oh my God." Yeah. And somebody decided to put this on their drinking cup, which is why we're looking at it here. But the reason I'm telling you this horrifying Greek myth, is that horrifying? Is that within it is encapsulated a microcosm of the space that ancient Greece reserved for the feminine. So, a couple notes about my terminology moving forward. I'm going to here be using male and female as shorthand for biologically male and female people. This is not to exclude people who didn't fit into this category, because of the way medicine was in the ancient world, and also the way that disease and nutritional deficits can act on pregnant women and young children. Intersex people were much more common in the ancient world and recognizable. So that's part of the biological landscape here. I'm not going to be spending too much time with it, but terminology-wise, that's what I'm doing there. Similarly, I'm going to be using men and women to talk about the gendered categories. So sex, for our purposes here, is what your body's set up like. Gender is where you align in your heart. And these two are not always the same, but when we're talking about giant generalizations and the way ancient people thought about male versus female and men versus women, there is a deliberate emphasis of the differences and a power hierarchy. So I'll be using male and female when I'm talking about gendery stuff, or sorry, male and female when I'm talking about biological sex, and I'm going to be using men and women when I'm talking about gender norms. Gender's all the social stuff, anything that doesn't have to do with what's in your pants and what it says on your jeans. So this is the clothing you wear, the behaviors you exhibit, the spaces that you're allowed into, the kinds of things that you participate in, your place in the economy, all of that stuff that gets bound up with gender norms and gendered expectations. That's the stuff that I'm going to have for men and women. Hi.
David.
Okay. So without any further ado then, I'm going to make some vast generalizations about what your life would have been like if you were a woman in the ancient Greek world. And here I'm going to focus on Greece, even though some of your authors are Roman, just for sanity's sake here. All right, about these sweeping generalizations, here's a nice bullet point list. I'm just going to make some notes as I go down. I'm starting with a really common phrase that we see on women's tombstones in both the Greek and the Roman world. She stayed at home and worked in wool was the highest praise for somebody who adhered to the ideals of femininity, of being a woman. This, however, isn't a 50s housewife kind of situation. Working in wool is the process by which wool is twisted into thread and then woven into clothing. And the manufacturing of clothing before the Industrial Revolution involved a lot more labor and a lot more time. But if you made extra, you could also make a whole lot of money off of this activity. So by making enough surplus cloth to, yes, Jim Jims, to sell, you are adding to your family's bottom line. So this isn't an exhortation to stay out of the workforce. Rather, this is a gendered sector of the labor force, is the woolworking sector, the cloth manufacture and caretaking and manipulation, all that stuff. And it required so much labor that every woman available, and some men and children as well, of both genders, would end up spending a lot of their day just doing this. I'm going to include a demo video I made for another class where I show you how to spin thread. And it's a cool thing to do. I find it a relaxing hobby, mostly because I don't have to do it to clothe my entire family. But it highlights just how long it would have taken to make a shirt. Also, it explains why clothing was the most frequently stolen item in the ancient world. Yeah. Cost Tyrese, why are you laughing at me? Okay. No. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Likewise, the staying at home part isn't stay out of the workforce or stay out of the economy. By stay at home, it means that you're managing a household, or you are part of the management system in the household. So this is a whole micro economy unto itself. And in an era before there were labor-saving devices, the stuff that you had to do to keep your living space clean, livable, make food, grow food, yes, was incredibly time-consuming, but also incredibly necessary. So this means that she worked a full-time job, a very gendered full-time job, but full-time nonetheless. So this isn't the 50s housewife, but this does have severe limitations to it. First, there are only so many activities that are considered respectable work for women. No, and not everybody likes doing them. Yes, James. Similarly, you're really distracting. Okay, hold on. All right. So there's similarly an expectation that women are to stay out of places and in others. There are places that men are not allowed into either in this culture. There's a physical separation maintained between the genders, and this means that there's a feminine subculture that modern historians have trouble accessing because it's also a subculture that doesn't get preserved in the kind of texts that we have today. Now, this is not saying that women didn't write texts in the ancient world. They did. There are quite a number of women scientists, specifically, that we know about because their work is cited by men. Pliny the Elder, for instance, is one of the only reasons we know about several lady scientists. Let's see, there's Sotira, Matrodora, Aspasia the gynecologist, uh, philosophy also had a lot of women authors. One of the interesting things about Pythagoreans is that they believed that women had an equal share of wisdom and rational thought. Pythagoras' wife and daughter were both philosophers in their own rights and important authors in the corpus of Pythagorean writing, but we've lost those books. We've lost almost everything formally written by ancient women, which is sad. So, the gold standard for idealized women's behavior was dependence. And here I'm talking about citizen women. So keep in mind, not all women were freeborn. Most were either enslaved or came from a family with a history of enslavement. The lower your social class and status and wealth, the more likely it was you'd be working out of the home doing things that weren't elite gendered labor. It is a luxury to be able to have your women folk at home in the house all day, not even going out to the grocery store. Dude. He's trying to pull my earrings out. Hold on. Okay, where were we? So, dependence was baked into the system. In order to access the legal system, you had to have your male relatives do that for you. Your father was legally responsible for you either in the Greek world until you married your husband, and then he and his family became responsible for you. In Rome, however, you're still your dad's even after you marry. And Romans also kept women's property legally separate, so your husband could not touch your property. So, yay, Gold Star Ancient Rome. Yeah, to not have a husband, a grown son, a cousin, some kind of male protector, was to be vulnerable in this society, and was also considered disreputable in and of itself, which gives you an idea of just how unfair the system could be, but also the vulnerability of single mothers. When you read texts from the ancient world, they'll use the word widow when they're talking about single mothers. Frequently, these are single mothers without family support, which is why they're one of the first groups that religious movements reached out to in an effort to help. We see this in the mysteries of Dionysus, for instance, and later in early Christianity because of this. Similarly, if you're enslaved, then the responsible person for you is your owner. Person here is not gendered, so men, women, intersex people, all owned enslaved people, and the person who owns you is the person who, well, legally owns you too, and if you are not obeying them and serving their interests, then you are considered dangerous and out of control and not a good person, which is also pretty messed up, but there we are. So, assuming that you're from a family who's wealthy enough that you can follow this pattern of marriage and in-home labor. So here we're talking like the uppermost levels of the urban poor, rural households, middle and upper class folks, definitely. Your main job was to raise the children and run the household economy. In fact, the word economy comes from the Greek word oikonomia, to run a household. As I said, this is a management position. This is a real job, just as housemaking is still a real job. But this is a society that actually recognizes that. Money coming into the house would go through the hands of the senior woman in that house. She would sign off on matchmaking and marriages, even though it was the husband who made the final decision to marry their child off to somebody else's child. Uh, Women were expected to have a voice in the process. And when they weren't given that voice, that was considered a bit of a problem and an area where you can get into danger. Hence, some of the myths, the Demeter and Persephone myth, Zeus didn't bother to ask Demeter about her daughter's marriage, and Demeter is horked off, not just because she's a goddess, but because a mother was expected to be involved in the process. So that was a breach. Now, I mentioned that there's a separation of the sexes, and this is a culture where sex and gender lines are falling close to one another. This, in some city-states, was pretty severe. Citizen women in Athens, for instance, were expected to stay in indoor spaces or all-women religious spaces only. They were only supposed to have male contacts that were like their husbands, their sons, their fathers. I mean, even brothers might have been a sketch or a stretch. But this doesn't mean that they're locked up in the house all day. Women have their own gatherings, their own religious rites, their own sacrifices, their own literature, their own poetry. Often they do this domestic labor together as a group, while one woman was reading or singing and everybody else would be doing their woolworking. So there's this whole workplace culture built around this gendered separation line, including a sharing of child rearing and child care responsibilities. Now, this isn't always an entirely happy egalitarian thing. A lot of women were enslaved to take care of other people's children, including breastfeeding. Uh, but because not everybody is capable of breastfeeding their children, and also this culture thought that upper class women shouldn't have to breastfeed necessarily, you would have women sharing breastfeeding duties. If you couldn't produce enough milk, you'd get your friend to feed your kid. If you had to go out and do something, you'd switch off. It was very, at its best, you get a community labor sharing, labor saving environment, but at worst, you have an economy of oppression where some women are enslaved by other women to defray the massive labor involved in running an ancient household. In some city-states, it wasn't this severe. For instance, in what is now Turkey, ancient Ionia, so these are the Greek-speaking city-states of ancient Turkey, and the Levant as well, women regularly went into public. You find a lot more women scientists and philosophers coming out of that milieu. Noble women frequently had a lot of influence and duties in the government. Similarly, Egypt had a much more open door between men's spaces and women's spaces. So if I had to pick a place to hang out in the ancient world as a woman, Egypt would be good. You have situations like Sparta, where often you'll hear people saying Sparta was this paradise for women because they got to do athletics and go outside, and they didn't have to stay home spinning all the time. But a culture where the government forces you to exercise and your children are taken away from you when they're 7 to be systematically starved and tortured into ideal Spartanhood is not my idea of a feminist utopia. Just saying. All right, on to custody. So a big part of why women were kept in a separate women-only environment in a lot of these places was in order to ensure the legitimacy of property inheriting children. So the way that this culture explained the need for restricting women was to make sure that a dude's kids were actually his kids. And there was a lot of anxiety around this. Like, are they really your kids? How can you be sure? And with this anxiety comes a lot of day to day cultural tension. And if we're going to get a little emotionalist about this, I think we can see the traces of this in ancient magic. The father had custody of the children. And in many cases, Rome in particular, uh, custody includes the right of life or death at certain points. So this can be quite extreme. Uh, this meant that in the event of a divorce, and divorce was pretty common in the ancient world, and frequently in a marriage where your family and your spouse's family had gotten together and made the match to cement a family alliance, if that family alliance breaks up, your relatives could force you to divorce because that's how alliance marriages work. So there's a lot of spillover in the personal and political here. In a divorce, the woman seldom, if ever, got any of the man's property. In Rome, she had her own property, and Roman dowries weren't a gift to the husband. The dowry was the wife's, and only the wife was allowed to touch that dowry, unless she was convicted of adultery, and then her spouse, or no, sorry, then the dowry reverts back to her father, not the spouse, in most forms of Roman marriage. But in other societies, the husband kept everything, the wife got nothing. She'd have to go back to her family if they would have her back, and her husband would keep the children. So this was constantly in the back of your mind in the ancient world, is if this marriage breaks up, who's going to save me? What's going to happen? Similarly, when women could inherit property, which did happen, it was as a last resort. So if you would run out of people with Y chromosomes, then you would go to women. But the women were expected to be placeholders of the property until somebody with a Y chromosome showed up in the family again. So often her son or a little brother, a nephew, something like that. But in some cases, you are the last of your line and you have property. But it was expected then that you would marry a guy who would then get the property, unless you were Roman. Romans, I'm not saying that Romans are perfect because they're not, but Romans do have an inheritance system where women, or your male and female offspring, both get equal shares of your inheritance. So there's no primogeniture. The oldest sibling doesn't get everything, and men and women are expected to inherit the same amount. Women can own property. And once you get into the Roman Empire, so the years CE, women can be given the right to full legal personhood, including the right to take people to court. Even before that, though, women already are. You just have to get a man to be your co-signer. But there were a few, Hortensia's one, female lawyers who were courtroom litigating lawyers, which is pretty nifty. Uh, it wasn't usual, though, but there were professions that were female dominated. For instance, obstetrics and gynecology, pharmacy to a certain point, just because of who had access to the kitchens. Um, so you did have opportunities as a woman to earn money that did not involve sex work, but often did involve sex work. When we're talking about sex work in the ancient world, for the most part, this is labor done by enslaved people, people of all genders. There are specific market sectors organized by gender and appearance and preferences. Organized, and we have a lot of information about it, but it's super duper depressing. A lot of free people who were involved in sex labor had been enslaved at some point in their past, and often their path out of enslavement was by trafficking other people as sexual labor. So that's a part of a lot of women's reality in the ancient world. survival sex is a big part of this economy. And that's the kind of precarious scenario that's in the back of your mind when you're afraid that your husband's going to divorce and leave you is, oh gosh, how am I going to earn my living? I bring this up because it's a major plot point in Medea's backstory. More about that in a bit. Now, as I mentioned, there are specific areas that are marketable and dominated by women other than sex work. Food is another one. Now, there are men who work as professional cooks in the ancient world, but the labor of making food is heavily feminized. So that is something you can do. Frequently, though, cooks were enslaved, so getting a job as a freelance cook would be like owning a hot food shop. But that is something that you could do if you had the startup money. Medicine is another thing where women held regular jobs and made a very good living. We have several monuments in the ancient world that were uh, put up by women physicians as a monument to their practice and contributions to their local economy. Craft is another thing, especially anything fiber adjacent, but dyeing, embroidering, again, clothing can make you good money. But clay crafting too, there's a range of sectors that women are doing labor in. And staying at home doesn't mean you're out of the workforce. For one reason I didn't get into at the beginning, and that's because the home is also a workspace. So production manufacturing, instead of being located in factories, was located in households. Or sometimes you'd have workshops with a large number of apprentices or enslaved people, or both. And this meant that when you were staying at home and working in wool, you might also be making pottery or helping with your family's business. A lot of women were shopkeepers out of the front of their houses. Um, Less so in ancient Athens. Ancient Athens is a lot more restrictive, but in ancient Rome, absolutely, women business owners are all over the place, and they can do it without leaving home. We have funeral art showing the daily lives of different people commemorated on their tombstones in the Roman world. And one of my favorites is this uh, woman and man who are running their bakery shop, where he's kind of in the back stocking a shelf and she's up at the counter serving a client, and she's got like her baby stuck on her hip, and there's another kid kind of hanging out on the side of the counter. That's the ancient workplace. One thing that's easy to forget is that the modern workplace where you go somewhere other than your home to do your work and you can't bring your children to it, that's really recent as an economic development, like post-industrial revolution. So in the 1820s, one of the reasons why there was so much backlash and protest among the working class against mills and factories and plants was that they were places that you couldn't take your dependent children to unless your dependent children were working there, and it was a dangerous place to take your children because the machinery was not OSHA compliant. There was no OSHA. And they had to shift from an economy where you could make a living and be in your house to an economy where you had to leave your house if you wanted to make a living at all. So the workforce as we experience it today is very new and very weird. And so it's the norm historically that, yeah, you do take your kids to work. And yeah, it is a normalized thing that you'll see kids kind of underfoot while adults are doing their family business. Um, I'm going to end this on a quote from the politician Pericles. So this is 430 BCE. He's Athenian, which is about what you expect for a quote like this, where he's saying, the best women are those who are known neither for praise nor blame. In other words, the best kind of a woman is a woman you don't even hear about because nobody talks about her. She's not even famous for being awesome. Now, this is interesting coming from Pericles, because Pericles is most famous for his girlfriend, the high profile Aspasia of Miletus. She was a female intellectual and philosopher. She was BFFs with Socrates, and she was one of the most influential political thinkers of her generation in Athens. Because she was an immigrant woman, Pericles was married to an Athenian citizen in order to have legitimate children with her. So Aspasia was his girlfriend, but his regular long-term girlfriend. And they had two sons together, one of whom was named Pericles Jr. So his child by Aspasia was Pericles Jr., not his child by his legal wife. And this points out the complexity that we get into when we talk about gender norms. Even if you're trying really hard to live up to all the gender norms, nobody can. It's impossible. We're individuals. We're people, not industrial products. And we're never going to quite fit. And that's not a bad thing, but culture can often make you feel like it is. And in this tension between what you should do and what your heart wants to do is Pericles, this guy who publicly claims that the best woman is the kind of woman nobody knows about, who's also dating one of the most famous women in the ancient world. Even Pericles wanted a woman he could relate to, and I'm really not fond of him, but I get it. Okay, Jim. So this is an Athenian house, just to give you an idea of how this separation was reinforced by the space. So the front of the house, get my red marker out, is split from the back of the house here by a courtyard. And this courtyard space, you can see it in several overheads of houses. These are all Athenian houses. The front includes a kitchen or workspace area, and then a kind of room that ancient Greeks called the man cave, the androne, which literally means man place. So man cave is a direct translation. It's not just me being cute. This is where you would invite all of your dude friends for your dude parties, where you would do dudely things like play drinking games and discuss philosophy, often at the same time, which explains a lot of Greek philosophy, if you ask me. Now, this is a place that you would invite women to who were not citizen women. So this is where you'd have Aspasia over for dinner, but for the most part, the only invited guests were men, and the women present were enslaved or hired entertainment. In the back of the house, there's a two-story area here with downstairs and upstairs. This is the bit of the house that the women dominate. And this includes workspaces, sleeping spaces, the if there's running water, sometimes there is, not really in Athens. You'd have at least a cistern for storing water, your groceries, all of the wealth and resources of the household is back here in the realm of women being managed and overseen. Sometimes quite literally, there are windows looking out of the top story, so you can keep an eye on what your enslaved labor is doing down in the courtyard. These are pretty fancy houses. A lot of people couldn't afford them. They'd live in apartment buildings with shared housing with roommate situations. There were also a lot of homeless people, or people who would live in improvised housing on the streets, in the spaces beside temple walls, that kind of thing. And this is how gender separating gets to be a sign of wealth. If you can afford to have a house big enough that you can keep your women shrouded in privacy, then you are a citizen of standing and somebody to be reckoned with. If you can't, if for economic reasons, the women in your family need to go outside into public and interact with mixed gender spaces or manly spaces, then you were considered less elite, less respectable, less valued. Here are a few artifacts that give you an idea of what objects are sitting around in the life of an ancient woman. Here at the top, this is from the Keramakos, the burial ground outside of Athens, are cosmetics. These are bits of makeup. So these are chalk mixed with dyes. The white ones contain chalk, a little bit of marble, and some of them white lead. So you'd scrape a little bit off this block, you'd mix it with oil, and then apply it to your skin to make yourself look paler so you could fit that gendered stereotype of a pale indoor lady versus a tanned, nice brown outdoor dude. The red you'd use for blush, lipstick, that kind of thing. Next to it is what looks like a little Dutch oven kind of thing. This is a terracotta cooking set. So you wanted your cook fire to be as small as possible to keep the fire risk low, and this is a little bit like a crock pot. So you'd put your stew items in here: beans, water, flavoring, salt, meat if you were lucky, fish if you were fancy, all up in there. And then you would put coals or heated rocks into the bottom here, and that would heat up the ceramic cookware to make you a nice stew. And then you take bread and you dip it into the stew, and that's how you would generally eat. Only fancy dinners were like lie down on the couch and eat grapes out of a bowl kind of deals. Most of the time, you're going to be eating stew with bread, stew with bread, stew with bread, and it's delicious. So below that, we have a comb. Now, this is used both for human hair and for sheep wool, and it's difficult to tell the difference, if there is one, between a woolworking comb and a hair comb in antiquity. The very fine teeth here suggest hair comb. The fine teeth are so that you're pulling lice eggs and other kinds of vermin out of your hair. You would use a combination of oil and these fine tooth combs to groom your hair and keep it vermin free, or at least vermin limited. The lice, when they're developing, if there's a lot of oil on the scalp, it can sometimes drown them and kill them, and often things would be added to the oil to make it more effective as a lice killing agent. Both men and women use this kind of comb, so this is not a gendered item. We find tons of them, for instance, in military encampments, because nobody wants to get typhus, nobody. But they're found very frequently with women because women are using them more frequently and going through them faster, because they're also using them to comb out wool, which is really hard on the tines, so you need more refills on your comb. Finally, we have this fancy mirror. Now, this you wouldn't have if you were just a regular Athenian. This is a very fancy Athenian's mirror. The surface is bronze, and this would have been polished so you could kind of see yourself in it a bit. And mirrors were used by everybody in the society, but they were heavily gendered in the same way that we heavily gender makeup mirrors. And, well, makeup. Everybody was wearing makeup, but it was considered appropriate only for women to wear makeup. It was socially acceptable for a woman to pay attention to her appearance. She'd get judged if she didn't. If she paid too much attention, she'd get judged too. And that's super familiar, isn't it? We are now looking at a pomegranate. It's also sometimes called a love apple, and this is because the pomegranate is not just associated with fertility rituals and the cult of Persephone, because Persephone ends up staying in the underworld because she eats pomegranate seeds while she's there. But the pomegranate was also used in both pro-conception and contraception recipes. The rind would be ground up and applied vaginally as a spermicide, and then also the eating of the seeds was considered to have a contraceptive effect. And this is why they're heavily associated with women and women's fertility. And we think one of the things going on with Persephone and the pomegranate seeds is that when she accepts the pomegranate seeds, she's eating something that's associated with sexual activity and taking control of your fertility. So by eating the pomegranate, she's practicing agency in her marriage, and this is what makes it finally legally binding. In some readings of the myth, that's one that people go back and forth on a bit. But you'll see pomegranates popping up in magical texts a lot for this reason. Now, there is something to this. However, we have better things now. Please don't use pomegranate to prevent babies. That's probably not hygienic or effective. Hi. Okie. So here are a few more domestic items. These are those associated with children and free time. So, in fact, most of these are children's items, and then I'll start with the D6s. D6s down here. These were found in the Athenian Agora, and this would have been one of the things that everybody does in this society to pass time. Men would do this in public gambling spaces, but it seems that women frequently gambled with each other as well. So even though activities are gender separated, they aren't necessarily gendered, especially the pastime game sort of things. Sports for little girls are a thing. There are women's athletic games, and there are hours at the bathhouses for women to use. So there, while you are staying at home and working on your wool and getting bored to death, one of the things you might end up doing is rolling some dice and doing some gaming, because girls like to game. Yeah, it's a horsey. See a horsey? Do you like the horsey? Horsey? Well, that's good, because that's a little boy or little person's toy. Little person? Mm-hmm. Well, do you want to talk about the horse? Horse. Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, so it's a little toy horse. It's a kid's toy horse. This is a remarkable survival because it's wooden as well. It's got the little wheels on it, so you can go. Exactly. Now, next to it is another very important thing to have if you have a small child. This is an ancient Greek potty chair. You put your kid's legs through here, and then the kid sits here, and then does their business down through the hole. And you've got a little spy hole in the front so you can see if they've gone. You just put them in there until they go. You go! Go, Stinky! That's not a kitty, that's a horsey. Finally, at the bottom, these are very fuzzy photographs because I hadn't eaten lunch yet when I took these, but you can still see well enough. So these are... Okay. These are tiny, tiny wine jars, and these were used in a ritual when your kid turned 2, where they would drink their first wine, which to us is like, baby's first wine? What? But water wasn't safe to drink in the ancient world. It was frequently contaminated with poop, it hadn't been sanitized, and safe drinking water is a thing. So what they'd do is they'd mix water and wine, and that was sanitized enough that you could drink safely. And when you wean your baby at around the age of 2 in the ancient world, they now have to drink something that isn't safe breast milk, and it can be a very dangerous period of passage and a choke point for infant mortality. So by making a ceremony out of baby's first wine, you're helping to offset the anxiety of an anxiety-ridden. I know, part of the process. And if you look at this wee little babykins, he's got a spear and a round shield, so he's already practicing for his future role. So yeah, it's a little baby, but he's got toy versions of what he's going to grow up to do for the state. Be a hoplite. Be a hoplite. Be a hoplite. Mm-hmm. You can't have any wine, mister. Wine? No wine. You are too young. The water is safe now.
No.
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 And then finally, some weaving equipment to give you an idea of what the physical requirements of working in wool all day would be like. These looms are upright, so you're going to be standing or kneeling, and then you're going to be taking the warp shuttle backwards and forwards across this very wide frame. This is about 2 women long. So either you'd get a partner that you could pass the shuttle back and forth to, or you yourself would be walking forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards all day, every day. So this is This is a form of exercise as well as household production. With the amount of wool you were processing, you would have to protect your thigh and your knee from the constant friction of wool on it. And that's what this is. This is an epinatron. This is a piece of terracotta that you'd use to shield your thigh, to keep lanolin off of your lap, and also to help felt fibers as you were spinning them.